When someone shows promise in their chosen field, it can feel like the world appreciates your talent. But when you find out, for whatever reason, that maybe you're not as great as you thought you were, a personal bubble can burst. And the consequences of this depend very much on the individual. Some people just commit to working harder around that talent. Some people chalk it up to experience and move on in a new direction. But sometimes, just sometimes, those people implode and seem intent on taking their failure out on a world that they feel does not appreciate their excellence. We're heading to Oregon in the far distant late 70s and early 80s for the story of an aspiring American footballer who found his dreams in tatters, and in response wrought evil across the Pacific Northwest of America. This is the abhorrent story of Randall Woodfield, and this is Murder of Crows. The Pacific Northwest, sometimes referred to as Cascadia, is a geographic region in western North America, bounded by its coastal waters of the Pacific Ocean to the west, and by and large by the Rocky Mountains to the east. Though no official boundary exists, the most common accepted version includes the US states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, along with the Canadian province of British Columbia. Some broader versions do reach north into Alaska and Yukon, south into northern California, and east into the western side of Montana. The region's largest metropolitan areas are Greater Seattle in Washington, with 4 million people, Metro Vancouver in British Columbia with 2.8 million people, and Greater Portland, Oregon with 2.5 million people. The major cities of Vancouver, Portland, Seattle and Tacoma all began as seaports, supporting the logging, mining and farming industries of the region, but have developed into major technological and industrial centres, such as the area referred to as the Silicon Forest, which benefit from their position on the Pacific Rim. If defined as British Columbia, Idaho, Oregon and Washington, the Pacific Northwest has 4 US national parks. Crater Lake in Oregon, and Olympic, Mount Rainier and North Cascades in Washington. If a larger region is used, then other national parks may be included, such as the Redwood National and State Parks, Glacier Bay National Park, Wrangell St. Elias National Park, Grand Teton National Park, and parts of Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park. The Big Dark is a term for winter in the Pacific Northwest. At a latitude of almost 48 degrees north, Seattle has sunsets before 6 p.m. between October and March, and fewer than 9 hours of daylight for many weeks around the time of the winter solstice. It was in Salem, Oregon, on Boxing Day 1950, that Randall Woodfield was born, the third child of an upper-middle-class family. His mother was a housewife, and his father was an executive at Pacific Northwest Bell. He had two older sisters, one of whom went on to become a doctor, and the other an attorney. The Woodfield family was well known and respected within their community. Woodfield was raised in Otter Rock, Oregon, a small seaside town about 8 miles or 13 kilometers north of Newport. Popular among his peers, he was a football star at Newport High School. And even though his childhood was by all accounts stable, Woodfield began to exhibit sexually dysfunctional behaviours during junior high school, and in particular exposing himself in public. While in high school, Woodfield exposed himself to a group of teenage girls on Yaquina Bay Bridge and was arrested. His football coaches helped conceal the incident to prevent him from being ousted from the team, though his parents forced him to attend therapy after the incident. These early experiences indicated the dichotomy that was within Woodfield. There was athletic prowess and peer acceptance on one hand, and then sexually motivated behaviours on the other. But as we see time and time again in the US system, for those with high potential in athletic endeavours, the powers that be in schools and colleges are willing to sweep these illegal and immoral activities under the rug in order to preserve the standards of academic athletic teams. And it's possible that this early tolerance of his less palatable behaviours led Woodfield to have a sense of untouchability as he moved through life. After graduating from high school, Woodfield's criminal record was expunged, and he attended Treasure Valley Community College in Ontario, Oregon, later transferring to Portland State University in Portland in 1970, where he played for the Portland State Vikings as a wide receiver. At Portland State, he was active in Campus Crusade for Christ, an evangelical Christian student group, and lived in an apartment located on the South Park blocks. Gary Hamblett, who was Woodfield's football coach at around this time, recalled of Woodfield, "When he was with me, he was the nicest, most gentlemanly kid I ever knew. He was quiet and polite, hard-working, and real coachable." Other teammates and peers of Woodfield around this time recalled him as being soft-spoken and kind of a loner who didn't have a lot of friends. But all did note his exceptional athleticism. But his darker nature was never far away. Despite his thriving in college, Woodfield was arrested on several occasions for petty crimes. First in 1970 for vandalising the apartment of his ex-girlfriend, and then later in 1972 for public indecency in Vancouver, Washington. In 1973 he was arrested again for public indecency in Multnomah County, Oregon. Woodfield chose to drop out of college 3 semesters shy of graduating with his BS in physical education, and was selected as a wide receiver in the 1974 NFL draft by the Green Bay Packers in the 17th round as the 428th overall pick, if that means anything to anyone. Woodfield tried to establish himself with the Packers during coach and general manager Dan Devine's last season, but could not shake his personal problems with a trip across the country. He signed a contract in February 1974, but was cut during the training camp, so thus failing to make the team's final roster. And while he had shown signs of sinister behaviour before this failure seemed to trigger a change and potentially escalation within Woodfield. Woodfield left Wisconsin in late 1974 and returned to Portland, feeling somewhat disgraced by his failure to succeed in his football career. In early 1975, several Portland women were accosted by a knife-wielding man, forced to perform oral sex, and then robbed of their handbags. Law enforcement responded to the string of crimes by having female police officers act as decoys. On March the 3rd, 1975, Woodfield was arrested after being caught with marked money from one of the undercover officers. Upon interrogation, he confessed to the crimes, blaming poor sexual impulse control, which he claimed was a result of his use of steroids. In April 1975, Woodfield pled guilty to reduced charges of second-degree robbery. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was freed on parole in July 1979 after having served 4 years. But if this period in prison was meant to curb the growing dysfunction within Woodfield, his future behaviour would make it clear that it hadn't worked. Because just over a year after his release, the level of his offending would escalate. On October the 9th, 1980, Sherry Lynn Ayers, an X-ray technician and former classmate of Woodfield, was raped and murdered in her apartment at Southwest 9th Place in downtown Portland. Her body was discovered on October the 11th by her fiancé. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed repeatedly in the neck. Ayers was a University of Oregon graduate and had known Woodfield since 2nd grade, having attended the same schools in Newport. During Woodfield's prior 4-year imprisonment, he and Ayers had corresponded via letters. Suspecting Woodfield's involvement in Sherry Lynn's murder, Ayers' family provided his name to law enforcement. He was questioned, but refused to sit for a polygraph test. Homicide detectives found his answers generally evasive and deceptive, but because his blood type did not match semen found in the victim's body, no charges were filed. 1 month later, on the morning of November the 27th, which was Thanksgiving Day, Woodfield arrived at the North Portland home of Darcy Renee Fix, who was 22 years old, and he was already planning to assault her. Woodfield had known Fix during college as an ex-girlfriend of one of his close friends. Douglas Keith Altig, who was 24, was at Fix's home when Woodfield arrived. Both Fix and Altig were subsequently bound and shot to death execution style in the home, and Fix's .32 caliber revolver was missing from the scene. Due to his acquaintance with Fix, Woodfield was questioned about the murders, but law enforcement found no concrete evidence pointing to his involvement. So were these cases a matter of guilt by association, or was this a man using that association to target people? After committing the murders of Fix and Altig, Woodfield began a series of robberies throughout the Pacific Northwest. On December the 9th, 1980, Woodfield, wearing a fake beard, as you do, held up a Vancouver, Washington gas station at gunpoint. In Eugene, Oregon, 4 nights later, on December the 13th, he raided an ice cream parlor. On December the 14th, he robbed a drive-in restaurant in Albany, Oregon. During one of the robberies, Woodfield wore what appeared to be a band-aid or athletic tape across the bridge of his nose, similar to the nasal strips worn by football players. On December the 21st, Woodfield, again wearing a false beard, accosted a waitress in Seattle, trapping her in a restaurant bathroom and forcing her at gunpoint to masturbate him. I would call him a wanker, but in this case it's probably more appropriate to call him a wank-e. By January 1981, law enforcement had dubbed the robber the I-5 Bandit, given his apparent preference for committing crimes along the Interstate 5 corridor. On January the 8th, he held up the same Vancouver gas station he had robbed in the December, this time forcing a female attendant to expose her breasts after he emptied the cash register. 3 days later, on January the 11th, he robbed a market in Eugene. Then the next day, on January the 12th, he shot and wounded a female grocery clerk at a store in Sutherlin, Oregon. Right, I need to give a trigger warning now about sexual assault on young children. You have been warned. You can stop watching now or skip ahead around 1 minute. This is a very short clip, but it's very graphic. On January the 14th, a man matching the description of the I-5 Bandit and wearing a false beard invaded a home occupied by two sisters aged 8 and 10. He ordered the girls to undress and sexually assaulted them, forcing the older girl to perform fellatio. 4 days later in Salem, a man matching the same description entered an office building and sexually abused two women, Shari Hull and Beth Wilmot. After this, he killed Hull and wounded Wilmot, leaving her for dead. On January the 26th and 29th, he travelled to southern Oregon and committed robberies in Eugene, Medford and Grants Pass. In the latter location, two females, a clerk and customer, were assaulted by the robber. On February the 3rd, 1981, the bodies of Donna Eckerd, 37, and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Charlotte Jarvis, were found together in a bed in their home in Mountain Gate, California, north of Redding. Each had been shot several times in the head. Forensic tests showed that the girl had also been sexually assaulted. The same day in Redding, a female store clerk was kidnapped and raped in a hold-up. An identical crime was reported in Eureka, California on February the 4th, with the same man robbing an Ashland, Oregon motel that night. Then on February the 9th in Corvallis, a man matching the I-5 Bandit's description held up a fabric store, molested the clerk and her customer before he left. 3 days later, robberies committed by a man matching the I-5 Bandit's description occurred in Vancouver, Olympia, and Bellevue, Washington. The Olympia and Bellevue incidents included 3 sexual assaults. Upon an impending visit to Portland, Woodfield planned a Valentine's Day party at the city's downtown Marriott Hotel, inviting friends and acquaintances from college. After no guests came, "I wonder why, Randall?" Woodfield drove to the Beaverton home of 18-year-old Julie Wright, who he had met while working as a bouncer at the Fawcett, a bar in Portland. He arrived at her home around 2 a.m. on February the 15th. At around 4 a.m, he raped and then shot Wright in the head, killing her instantly. Police investigating the scene determined that Wright had had a glass of wine with her attacker and had also begun to prepare coffee. A package of instant coffee was discovered on the kitchen counter, and water in a kettle had been left to completely boil away. By February the 28th, the investigation was now focused on Woodfield. But by then, the I-5 Bandit had struck 3 more times. In Eugene on February the 18th and 21st, and with another sexual assault in Corvallis on February the 25th. Detectives in Marion County assembled a call log showing that Woodfield had placed calls via calling cards at payphones near the murder sites around the times that they were committed. On March the 5th, 1981, Woodfield was brought into the Salem Police Department for an interrogation after he had been positively identified in a photo lineup. His apartment in Springfield, Oregon, was subsequently searched 2 days later by warrant. In the apartment, law enforcement discovered a spent .32 caliber shell casing inside a racquetball bag, as well as a roll of tape that matched the tape found on the victims. On March the 7th, Woodfield was taken into custody after being positively identified by several Oregon robbery victims. On March the 16th, indictments for murder, rape, sodomy, attempted kidnapping, armed robbery, and illegal possession of firearms were initiated from various jurisdictions in Washington and Oregon. In the summer of 1981, Woodfield was tried in Salem for the murder of Hull, as well as charges of sodomy and attempted murder of Wilmot, and Wilmot testified against him in the trial. And it was this testimony that was key in the prosecution's conviction. In a curious aside, Chris Van Dyke, son of actor Dick Van Dyke, was the Marion County District Attorney at the time, and it was he who prosecuted the case. Van Dyke would later characterize Woodfield as the coldest, most detached defendant I've ever seen. On June the 26th, 1981, after 3.5 hours of deliberation, Woodfield was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison plus 90 years. In October of 1981, a second trial was held in Benton County, Oregon, in which Woodfield received sodomy and weapons charges tied to one of the attacks in a restaurant bathroom. Prior to this trial, his defense counsel attempted to move the trial from the Willamette Valley owing to the publicity the case received. They felt that Woodfield would not get a fair trial there. But the judge in the case denied counsel's request, along with a request to hypnotize a prosecution witness in an effort to determine if that witness had been influenced by the media coverage. Woodfield was convicted by the jury and had an additional 35 years added to his already instated sentence. Good enough for the dirty bastard. Despite the apparent links with countless other crimes and homicides, Woodfield would not be prosecuted for the majority of the crimes he was believed to have committed. Unable to afford multiple trials, the state of Oregon was satisfied with Woodfield's existing life sentence. Woodfield is serving his sentences at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. In October of 1983, he was injured by a fellow inmate during a prison disturbance. In April of 1987, he filed a $12 million libel suit against Ann Rule, the author who had written The I-5 Killer, an account of Woodfield's life and crime spree in 1984. The federal court in Oregon dismissed the lawsuit in January of 1988, citing that the statute of limitations on such a lawsuit had expired. By 1990, after the discovery of more victims, Woodfield was suspected in as many as 44 homicides. In 2001 and 2006, DNA testing linked Woodfield to 2 additional murders in Oregon that occurred from 1980 and 1981.
Already locked up for life is now on the hook for 4 more Northwest murders.
You may remember the name. Randall Woodfield's killing spree terrified people up and down the West Coast, all along I-5. He's called the I-5 Killer. It is the stuff of Hollywood movies and novels. Our local 6 reporter Sally Showman spoke with famed author Ann Rule this afternoon. Now, Sally, Ann wrote a book about Woodfield back in the 1980s.
She did, and that book was called The I-5 Killer because Woodfield's victims spanned the I-5 corridor from Washington all the way down to California. And today, Rule told me she's not surprised that he's now linked to 4 additional murders. In fact, she wrote about these victims in her book.
As of
today detectives have definitively linked Randy Woodfield to 7 murders, but they suspect the I-5 killer is responsible for as many as 24 more.
It's not a huge surprise, but it's gratifying. I don't think they can give him any more time than he already has, but he's responsible for probably more murders than we realize.
It was the details of his crimes that interested crime writer Ann Rule back in the early 80s. She said he jumped on and off I-5 in his gold Volkswagen Bug, sexually assaulting women and killing them, all the while wearing disguises.
Often he put tape over the bridge of his nose, which really hides what people look like.
While serving a life sentence, Woodfield read Rule's book about him. He sued her unsuccessfully for libel and even made threats against her.
There were 2 very naive young women in Salem who started visiting him. And he told them that he'd never killed anybody, but if he started, he would start with me. So I keep track of where he is, and I don't think he's going anywhere soon.
It's been almost 30 years since she wrote the book, but Rule says she'll never forget Woodfield and his horrific crimes.
Randy hasn't had quite as much publicity as some of the other serial killers. He may turn out to be one of the most prolific serial killers that we have ever known.
Now, prosecutors have decided not to press charges against Woodfield in these 4 additional murders because he's already serving a life sentence. If he is ever eligible for parole, Multnomah County's district attorney says he will reconsider that decision. Reporting for you live along I-5, Sally Showman, Coin Local.
Jim Lawrence, a detective for Portland's Cold Case Unit, noted Woodfield's lack of remorse or responsibility in his crimes, with him saying, "If you're talking about somebody moving towards some form of rehabilitation, they had to at some point acknowledge they are responsible for their own behaviors." That is not Randy Woodfield. Lawrence also noted Woodfield's egotism during his early interrogations, with him saying, when he was interviewed, he'd tell detectives that he'd never rape a girl. He said he didn't have to. They wanted him. Ann Rule, who had documented Woodfield's crimes in the I-5 Killer, suggested that rejections and feelings of inadequacy were factors that drove him to violence, particularly against women. She also characterized Woodfield as a smooth ladies' man whose good looks and disposition aided him in his ability to trap victims. And that was the case of the I-5 Killer, a man whose continuous escalation, frequency and severity of attacks, along with uncertainty around the accurate number of victims, mean it's difficult to assess whether he is a serial killer or indeed a spree killer. Despite only 1 murder conviction, he had 7 confirmed murder victims, with these being Sherry Lynn Ayers, Darcy Fix, Douglas Altig, Shari Lynn Hull, Donna Eckerd, Janelle Jarvis and Julie Wrights. As I said, he has been suspected in up to 44 murders. This video is dedicated to all victims of this cockwomble, especially those who were traumatized and survived. If you've made it to this point in the episode, Thank you so much for bearing with me and sticking with the episode to the end. Thank you for watching another episode of Murder of Crows. Please consider subscribing and joining our incredibly supportive community. But with that said, I'm Steve. This fluffball is Samson. And we will see you when we see you.
Say that you're ready, but you won't like it. You say that